Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're listening. Welcome back to AI and the Future of Work. This is your host, Dan Turchin, advisor at Insight Finder, the system of intelligence for IT operations, and CEO of PeopleRain, the AI platform for IT and HR employee service. Each week, as you know, we share conversations with entrepreneurs, thought leaders, investors, and journalists who are defining how we'll live and work for the next, say, 30 years. Today, we meet an entrepreneur who has been developing machine learning technology since 2016, after having spent more than a decade in various roles at SAP. Filip Dousek founded and later sold his last company, Stories, to Workday. But he's also a deep thinker, a mentor, and the author of Flocks Without Birds, a 2-volume novel that confronts traditional thinking about if and how the whole relates to the sum of its parts. Filip founded Stories to automate the process of extracting insights from data. Stories was invited to join the Alchemist Europe Accelerator, a highly selective program for exceptional startups where both Filip and I are mentors. Alchemist invests mostly within the US. Filip and Stories were based in the Czech Republic, making his journey to a successful exit all the more impressive. Filip is a reminder that entrepreneurs are everywhere. You'll enjoy hearing about his personal journey and eventual successful exit. Follow Filip on Substack. He's at dousek.substack.com. Follow him on Twitter at fdousek, Dousek. You can also order his book. It's at flock, singular, withoutbirds.com. Without further ado, Filip, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the podcast. Let's get started by having you share a little bit about your background and how you got into this space.
Thank you, Dan. With pleasure. And thank you for having me on the podcast. So let me just start in one sentence with sort of the space, okay? With the end. So what we have really built at Stories is software that automates data analytics. And it took us, it took us a couple of years to really work out whether the concept will work. And we've been working on this now for about 6 years. The first 3 years as a standalone company, and now for the last 3 years as part of Workday. And so how did I get to this? My background is a combination of mathematics, programming, and economics. And so it's almost sounds obvious that I would end up in analytics. But back in 1999, when I was finishing my university degree, analytics really wasn't a space. And so my road toward analytics was a longer one. Looking back at my path, I think I was always drawn by complexity. That is probably the overarching theme there. So my first real job after the university was working as an SAP consultant for large enterprises. So, and what we were doing was we would always come to a company, large company, large enterprise with multinational operations, and we would start modeling that company in the SAP software. And it would take us a year or 2 years to really effectively model the processes of that company in the software, right? That's what's called an SAP implementation. And that I was doing that for about 10 years. And it really opened up my eyes to how large enterprises work, and how they are managed. And what has been fascinating me toward the end of that phase, that era, was that I could see how much data companies are really sitting on, and how little of it really when we talk about running those companies, and that gap, that tension between the available data and use data or usable data has really been what brought me into analytics. I thought we really need to start helping companies run more efficiently using the data that's available. And that was the interesting part for me. So I spent a couple of years then working on individual analytical projects. And eventually I started seeing how similar those analytical projects are. Whenever we come to a certain company, we would be doing certain steps again and again. And I thought, well, this doesn't really scale. Like, there must be another way. Back then, many companies were actually saying, hey, we need to teach people how to work with data. There was this concept of the citizen data scientist and data-driven company culture, and we were trying to instill that in their enterprises for a couple of years as well. And we could again just see how difficult it is to solve the problem of a data overload with just human power. And that's where really the idea of let's automate this. Let's write code that's going to be sifting through those millions of data points that the companies are sitting on to surface just the key insights that really matter the most.
So you built this amazing technology. You had a great ride with the Alchemist program, and then you decided eventually to sell to Workday. Talk us through your entrepreneurial journey, and what was the decision like to eventually be acquired?
So it was a pretty fast and adventurous ride. We got acquired less than 3 years after starting the company. I think something that in retrospect is fairly specific about our journey is that we were a startup founded in Central Europe, in the Czech Republic, in Prague. And that has its pros and its cons. So on the pro side, Prague was almost like a enterprise laboratory for us. We had the largest companies in many industries, basically within walking distance. And at the same time, there wasn't much depth in any of those markets. So when we wanted to focus on large enterprises, in any industry, we had one or two players to work with, but all of them were pretty accessible. So it was, in a way, that was a very natural setting for us to start building a horizontal product, right? Which I think is quite a different situation from if we would be starting this in the Bay Area, for example. There's such depth in every market, in every industry, that we would logically, and it would be much more logical to be going deep in one industry. So while we were acquired by Workday eventually, and our technology is today used to analyze employee data or HR data, like the original engine before the acquisition was actually broadly applicable. We have used the same logic to analyze sales data, promotion data, logistics data, and in many industries. We had banking customers, we had retail customers, we had education customers. So that was quite specific, I think, about basically what the location offered and forbid. So that's one. The second thing that I would say was quite specific about our journey was that we really had a group of highly talented people, small group of mathematicians and super skilled coders who were really tightly knit group. And even when we were getting acquired, we didn't really have a full-fledged product manager, for example. We didn't have a marketing person. So we were still in the phase where very strongly focused on making sure that the product even works or even exists. Like that was the hard proof point, right? So we're starting from this idea. What if everyone in the company, in the enterprise, could actually receive just 5 or 10 top insights in their area of responsibility, instead of reports, instead of dashboards, right? Just 5 or 10 stories that matter the most. And I think it was a fairly audacious idea. I still think so today. Like it's very non-trivial to actually build that. And so it was quite unclear whether we can even build this. And so the first year that we have really spent just working out from a mathematical and conceptual angle, like what is a story? What is an insight? How do you define that? What makes a good insight? What is a useful insight? And so we spent, a year or two basically working out the engine itself. And when we got to the phase that we really needed to start scaling out our business operations, so hiring a sales team, hiring marketing people, hiring product managers, and building out this company, it felt like we're at a crossroads. And it was about the time when we got accepted to Alchemist. It was at about the time when we actually got named Gartner Cool Vendor as one of 3 analytics companies worldwide that year. It was about the time when we also met Workday and started talking about the acquisition. And so we really had these 2 paths ahead of us. It was either we will start building out the enterprise operation as a standalone company, or we will join forces with someone who does that exceptionally well and continue focusing on the product. And when I looked inside my soul, I felt like the second path was the one that I wanted to do, and I felt like my partners were on the same boat there. It was just for us really more exciting to join forces with a company that does enterprise sales really well and give us the space to continue focusing on building the product. And well, that's what happened. And we today we have hundreds of customers thanks to the happy union with Workday, and I think that bet has worked out really well.
Talk us through the acquisition process. Did Workday find you? Did you find Workday? How long did the acquisition take?
So this is where I will give credit to Gartner. Gartner invited us as a pretty small startup to their one of their conferences, and I had 10 minutes to talk about our technology there. And by the end of that conference, we were talking with 3 companies who were at that conference about the potential acquisition. The number eventually went up to 5, and Workday was one of them. And it was really the one where eventually we saw the best fit, and that was very much also on the cultural side and people side. So it felt like we really hit it off together.
So you're a mathematician and an economist by training. Talk us through what you consider the hardest technical problem that Story solved.
So I've already mentioned that we had to start really from scratch on the conceptual level. For the last couple of years, many people talk about data storytelling, right? But when you want to formalize that into an algorithm, when you want to create an algorithm that automatically tells or narrates stories, it really opens up this question of what is a story? Not only that, but what is an interesting story, right? When you have a really large data set with tens of millions or even hundreds of millions of records, how do we answer the question of what's important? And those are these really big questions, I think, that we're just attacking from different angles. We're experimenting a lot. We were trying out approaches and seeing what works, what doesn't work. Sometimes it felt almost endless because the results for a long time just were not satisfactory, but we're progressing. And so I think, on one hand, really coming to a definition of a useful story was that was one hard part. And then, if I say this a little bit more formally or a little bit more explicitly, we typically, our algorithm is really a data reduction algorithm. So we take in millions of data points, we output 10 top stories. Defining how the reduction should work is just another way of looking at the same question. So we basically had to come up with an algorithm that would describe the data set as a list of stories where each of them is interesting and yet they do not overlap each other, and they describe the data set well, right? Like if I walk into a forest and I want to say, I would like to say in 10 sentences what is in this forest. So I'll start with the trees maybe, and I'll say that there are many tall trees here. Great, so I can cross out the trees. What is left? I can see some bushes, right? So maybe my second story is there are many bushes here growing on the ground. Great, so I can cross that out. What else is there? Then I maybe need to start talking about bugs and insects, right? And and I only have 10 slots, for example, right? So how do I approach basically this question of describing a complex space with only 10 different sentences? I think that was the hard problem.
So you casually use the adjective interesting. Now, in the past, we've had guests talk about using machine learning algorithms to automate the process of extracting a summary from a large corpus of documents or an individual document. But once you apply that adjective interesting, it implies some level of intelligence beyond just extraction. What does interesting mean in the context of employees?
Right. Naive approach would be, well, let's use machine learning for that, and let's see what comes out. And that is a path that felt like too random to us. What we have rather done was to start looking at what do managers find interesting, and really start codifying expert knowledge, expert opinion into the intelligence of the machine. So we spoke with a lot of managers in those different areas, and we started seeing that what they typically look for in data are certain patterns. Very often, these are quite simple patterns. They could be outliers. They could be, how are we doing compared to last quarter, and where are the biggest variances compared to last quarter? It could be which new trends have emerged, or what are the largest trends in a given data set. And so we started building a library of these patterns that managers typically look for. And in an interesting sort of development, we found out that pretty much all of those patterns need a common infrastructure. So we were able to really code for those patterns and basically plug them into a common analytical processing engine.
Given that process, what do you think are the good kinds of, the appropriate problems for machine learning? And where do you think some kind of, human curated, like you said, it kind of a library or a set of patterns are a better fit when it comes to automation and using big data?
Where we have used machine learning was really especially to optimize our algorithms, but the core of the reduction, besides the pattern matching, has really been graph analysis. That was one step which for us has been really illuminating. Was once we have identified the most important patterns in the data, we would turn them into a graph. And that gave us an almost perfect understanding of what is happening within the company in context of itself. And then we basically, in the next step, needed to reduce the graph. And that's where we use machine learning to really reduce the graph. But so that was our approach and our sort of, the shape of our problem. I believe you were asking like what other problems there are that offer themselves well to machine learning. Well, it's at the moment and we have a wealth of different machine learning algorithms, right? But by the way, I think this whole space of how do we match different machine learning algorithms with different shapes of problems, I think that's a pretty underdeveloped space. I'm still looking for someone to write something really engaging on that, because most of the books and most of the material that I can see on machine learning is highly technical, but few talk about matching different types of problems with different types of machine learning algorithms, right? But so there's data reduction or dimensionality reduction. That's one interesting space. There's it's whenever we really need to match many different attributes, shapes of problems lend themselves to different machine learning algorithms.
You mentioned now Stories has hundreds of customers under the Workday umbrella. No pun intended, but tell us a story. Pick a customer. Tell us how they use the Stories technology as part of Workday.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's several areas that our product currently analyzes. It's diversity in a company. It's organizational composition. It's hiring. It's retention and attrition, and it's talent and performance. We're very soon also going to be analyzing skills across the company and skill gaps. And showing the top stories in all of these areas, right? So one of the stories that I really like to talk about is a customer who has basically seen a story about attrition in one of their locations, and this attrition has been mostly linked to their female workers, to highly senior workers with long tenure. At the same time, there was a second story in the same location where we would see that the HR team in that location is also losing workers, right? So from two different angles, we can see that there's a problem in that location with the senior female talent and with retaining senior female talent that's most likely also being exacerbated by the fact that the company is losing HR talent in that location. So, and the very interesting thing is that this came up as a top story within the company, even though this wasn't by far the largest location, but it came up as a top story after analyzing thousands and thousands of different potential stories, right? So in the end, it not only tells us like where to focus, but it also gives us the confidence that we're focusing on really the most exceptional problem that is present in the data.
Does the story include a recommendation about what to do, or is it just surfacing the insight?
So not presently. It does include what we call the second order analysis, right? So the why. So we not only show that there is a, for example, problem with attrition in the given location, but also those different dimensions that it's linked in. And it could be gender, it could be tenure, it could be ethnicity, it could be actually the pay grade. It could be many different things. And we automatically analyze all of those factors related to that story. The question of what to do about that is something that has been on our mind for a long time. And we are now starting to work in that direction. First of all, we're not going to be jumping to recommendations straight away, but we are, because we are part of Workday and because those subsequent actions are typically carried out in the Workday system, that really gives us a very good opportunity to to allow managers, so the experts in this situation, to record the actions that they are doing, to plan the actions that they are doing, and then for us to analyze whether those actions have been successful. So, and that's really where the term augmented analytics come into play. We very much like to think about our technology as augmenting or supplementing the human worker rather than replacing.
So what you're doing is, like you said, a classic case of augmenting the intelligence of the live worker, the live employee. Talk us through the skills that will be needed in the workplace, let's say in 10 to 20 years, that you think will never be good candidates for full autonomous automation.
Absolutely. So, this is an interesting question, right? I think for some 100 or 200 years, we have been basically defining humanity on the other boundary, sort of what differentiates us from the animals, what is unique about people. And we're suddenly now facing like almost an analogous question on the other end of the spectrum, like what differentiates us from AI, and what is our defensible advantage? I think it's there are several that immediately come to mind. So the first one is creativity and everything that has to do with that. And creativity is very different from randomness, right? When we come up with creative ideas, they are actually rooted in meaning. When we come up with creative solutions to a problem, those solutions have a clear link to that problem, right? The linking around meaning is the second, I think, fundamental quality of humans that will be very hard to replace. I'll give an example. When we read a blog post, there's a lot that happens in our minds that has to do with how we derive meaning. Right? We're really linking the meaning of the text to library of information, a library of meaning that we have built up in the past. And this is still quite different in its effect to what today's machine learning algorithms do. Right? We are able to work consciously with meaning. That's the next step, right? So consciousness is another part that really will be very hard to replicate in AI. And it's almost like that is not a learned skill. It's something that we are gifted with, right? But it's very defensible, basically, for us humans, the way we work consciously with meaning. And the last part on here that I will mention is the way we again work consciously with emotions, which allows us to relate. It allows us to talk, to have relationships that are, again, meaningful. So these are the four words that I would mention that I think are at the core of all of the other skills and qualities that humans will retain as unique for a very long time. That's consciousness, emotions, meaning.
What is one technology that you think will be commonplace in the workplace in, call it 2030, 2035, that today would just seem like science fiction?
So one that I keep thinking about is actually telepathy. We see developments on multiple fronts that are taking us toward a more natural, or the most natural interaction between our minds and computers. Eventually, it's possible that we will not have to be talking, that we will be able to transfer our thoughts in the form in which we think them directly to ideas, and we'll be able to skip this cumbersome mouth interface. So that is one that I think is still very much open, whether it will happen or not, and how soon. But one that I think is really promising is is also along this direction, but closer to today, and that's having almost like a sidekick in our daily interactions. So, and I think Google Glass was one of those technologies that maybe was making or hinting at a promise of this, like having almost like a coach with us in the different daily interactions. One way or another, I believe that's where we're going, because if you really want to accelerate somebody's like career progress, having a full-time coach with him or a partner would be of tremendous value. And I think this could have different forms. It could be really some invisible technology, and whether that's in ear or in eye, who knows? But it could also be at first human-driven. It could eventually be leading toward AI, of course. But perhaps there's a middle ground of like, job shadowing or job pairing. We see that in programming, right? Like extreme programming basically is this concept where developers code together, where two developers work on a single piece of code. And there's no reason why we shouldn't be extending this to sales, to marketing, to just our daily meetings, and just having someone watching over our back and helping us improve in those interactions. I think that's what we'll see.
I've asked that question many times. That is the most thought-provoking answer I've heard, specifically about telepathy, the idea that we could somehow transfer our thoughts without speaking. And second, the thinking that maybe in the next decade we could become cyborgs in a positive way, that culmination of the fusion of humans and machines. I hope you'll come back when we're all cyborgs to take credit, and maybe we'll have a deeper conversation about that. We're about out of time. I want to make sure that I got in this one last question, because I know that you mentioned in the intro you're a deep thinker, and you're in the process of publishing Flock Without Birds. If you could share with us the thesis behind that and kind of how that relates to some of what you've accomplished in your professional life.
Okay, with pleasure. Thank you. So there are two levels of that book. There is the narrative book, there is the narrative layer, and there is the philosophical layer. And on the narrative layer, there's actually a really interesting parallel with my startup. The protagonist of that book is a PhD student who is writing software that automates data analysis and tries to find whether there is some overarching meaning and Uber pattern in all of the random data, in all of the random events around us. And so it's almost like a single idea here, is on one hand embodied in my novel, and on the other hand found another form in our startup. Interestingly, someone brought that to my attention quite long after we started the company. Like, I wasn't thinking about it consciously until way later. And also interestingly, so the book was first. So I wrote it a couple of years ago, originally in Czech, almost as a science fiction. And then basically the startup was in a way an attempt to bring that technology into life. So that's one level how the book relates to the company. The other level is really on the philosophical level. The book itself is about the subconscious models that underlie the Western thinking. So the thinking in our civilization and our culture. And I talk about basically how we are shifting as a society from objects and hierarchies toward dynamic networks, and how this shift is going to be transforming our politics, our arts, our foundations of mathematics, and our relationships and daily lives. And quite interestingly, stories in its core engine also has a basically graph analytics engine. That idea of looking at data through the prism of graphs or networks is something that I think we'll see more and more and more over the next 10 and 20 years.
Where can our listeners go to learn more about the book or buy a copy?
So the book in English will be coming out quite shortly. So at the moment, the best thing to do is to look at www.flockwithoutbirds.com and sign up for my newsletter, or drop me an email. There is an email address at the website, and I'll be sure to come back to those interested listeners once the book is out in a few months.
Philip, before I can let you go, I got to get in this one last question. So you got a lot of international entrepreneurs listening. So you had a successful exit starting in Prague. Like you mentioned, it was useful for you to team up with a technology company based in the US for access to a broader set of customers. Talk us through the challenges and the opportunities of starting a company outside of a traditional technology hub.
So I mentioned one, and there was, like the shape of the market can be different and different in an advantageous way. That is one. The other one, well, in Central Europe specifically, we have access to really good engineers at a fraction of the cost that is typical. And in some way, what we have done could be seen as geographical arbitrage. Like, we have built a company with a fairly modest amount of capital where that money took us probably 3 times farther than we could. It would take us if we were building the team in the Bay Area. So that is one way how to look at a remote location, remote from the Bay Area as an advantage. It's also, the fact that we have founded stories in Europe is another topic in itself. That I find it an open question whether startups in the enterprise space really need to be going to the US and to the Bay Area, and when. I found it very interesting, very useful, both on the business side, but also personally, to actually take that step at one point. But we did it after we have matured the technology, after we have used up the laboratory setting or laboratory resources of our home base. And then we decided, okay, well, Bay Area is our next place. But that doesn't necessarily have to be the case for everyone. I think in enterprise, it's quite possible to build a Europe first company that will be highly successful, and that will be rather solving the go-to-market challenges of Europe with its market fragmentation at first, even before going to US. I think that's a valid path as well.
Well, Philip, we're out of time, but thanks for coming by. Congrats on all the success, and I'm looking forward to that part 2 of this conversation about telepathy and cyborgs. What do you say?
So will I then. So will I.
Good stuff. Well, we'll put that on the calendar. A decade or so out.
Excellent.
That's all the time we have for today. This is Dan Turchin, your host of AI and the Future of Work. Back next week with another fascinating guest.